Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. It's actually very dark here in Scotland already in the afternoon. So welcome to this webinar from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Purbrick. I'm a quite new Institute Director and very glad to be here to help facilitate this forum. The event today is co-hosted with the Defence and Security Forum. And as you know, the focus today is on China to discuss a challenge in the Eastern Mediterranean, in particular in relation to the Belt and Road strategy. Our panelists for this discussion are Marco Vicenzino, and Marco, please excuse me if my pronunciation is at all off, and Dr. Georgios Filis. Marco heads the Global Strategy Project, which focuses on geopolitical forecasting and risk and international business advisory. He serves as strategic advisor to many senior executives in corporations and entities operating globally. And as he's just explained to us before many of you joined this call, he lives in many different places, it seems. So I'm sure you have some very large suitcases to travel with, Marco. We also have Dr. Georgios Filis, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations and Strategy in the Ledra College in Nikosia, where he teaches interdisciplinary courses relating to European political and economic affairs, international relations, international political economy. Quite a fascinating and a very wide area, Dr. Filis. And our hosts, who I'll hand you over to shortly, are Roddy Gow, who is the chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, and Lady Olga Maitland. And I'm sure you need no introduction to Lady Olga, who founded the Defence and Security Forum in 1983 and has led that group to become, I think, one of the leading think tanks in the UK with a very strong global reputation. So just a few rules of engagement, if we could. For attendees today, could I just remind you, if you haven't done so already, please mute your microphones, disable your camera. If anyone has forgotten, we'll mute them for you from the host account. If you have questions throughout the discussion, if you could put them in the chat box, the Zoom chat box, either privately or publicly. You can put them privately to me and I'll help you to put them. If you'd like to put your questions in person later on, please do say, and we'll enable your video and audio to do so. And we'd like to get through as many of your questions as possible at the end, obviously. So without further ado, Roddy, could I hand over to you to start the discussion?
Martin, yes, and thank you, and welcome everybody to this Zoom on what, as I've reflected on it with Lady Maitland, is an increasingly relevant subject about what China is up to in the Eastern Mediterranean and how that impacts Greece and Greece's relationship with China. And I'm delighted that Marco and George are both on this call. So I'm going to start off, Marco, by putting a question to you to discuss and then also for George to answer. And then I'll be perhaps a couple more questions from me, and then Olga will be talking with you as well before we open it up. So let's start off with this. President Xi of China has said China and Greece must together promote the building of a new type of international relationship based on respect, justice, and mutually beneficial cooperation. Is that what's happening, or are there other deeper forces at work here? Marco.
It's a diplomatically correct statement to make, but in reality, the #1 priority for China in the Eastern Mediterranean and Greece and much of other parts of the world is basically is the expansion, the rollout of its of securing a network of critical infrastructure in terms of ports, railroads, for its global economic expansion. Together with that, obviously, there are security interests, diplomatic interests. So I think for China, what was said, the statement that you just made from President Xi is a statement that's been replicated in either one form or another with several other countries around the world, particularly those countries that are smaller, have much more limited resources, usually are heavily in debt, but like I said, are strategically important in terms of the locations. And Greece specifically, if we look at the Port of Piraeus as one of many examples, is a key component. As one of the largest ports in Europe, it provides China with a critical point in terms of distribution of its products and in terms of also developing networks, transportation networks throughout the Balkans. So it's not just Greece. If you look at a country like Serbia, for example, the relationships between President Vučić of Serbia and the Chinese is very close, and that was demonstrated at the early stages of the COVID pandemic. So it's Greece, yes, is one part, but also there's the link to Serbia and many other parts throughout the region. Once again, you're always looking at the map. The Eastern Mediterranean is a broad region. Greece is an important part in terms of the European link to the Eastern Mediterranean, and to an extent, as is Cyprus. Then you have another NATO ally, but obviously increasingly difficult ally for the West has been Turkey. You have the situation in Syria. You look at Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Libya. This is, you can call the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Eastern Mediterranean, apart from the immediate players who are there are many international players, particularly Russia. Look at its involvement in terms of its bases in Syria. Increasingly, it's been more involved in Libya. And obviously the US with the strongest military presence in the region. But Russia, you can call, I mean, China, you can call it a new kid on the block, but an increasingly important one that's looking to secure its economic interest there. Also one that's looking to ensure that diplomatically, none of the players in the region oppose it, say anything against China, or go and contradict China's official diplomatic line. And there's a final link I would want to just point out before, I'll pass the floor on to George, is the fact in terms of security military. In that sense, the region is already overcrowded. With the powers of the region and those beyond, we're looking primarily Russia, the US. China is new to the region. Years ago, China, many people would have said China wouldn't really have a security military presence beyond its immediate vicinity. And then in recent years, we saw it build a base in Djibouti in East Africa and involved in anti-piracy operations off the Horn of Africa. Now, the question is, would China eventually at some point, I think now it wouldn't be involved, but it's important not to rule out that possibility in the future. Would it be a difficult move? Yes, it wouldn't be an easy one because it wouldn't be particularly welcomed by many players in the region. If you're looking particularly at the, France, the UK, and the other European powers, the British would have base in Cyprus. The Americans would in bases throughout in Greece, the port of Haifa. So it wouldn't be particularly welcomed by the other powers. But once again, as the region changes drastically and in a very fast way, there's many voids in the region. One, for example, I would just say as an example, look at Turkey. Turkey's a NATO ally. It's, for the most part, due to its own doing, or doing of President Erdogan, it's isolated itself in the region. Now, at some future stage, and this is an example, if they were to break off their relationship with NATO or with the West, that could leave a void for China. Now, does that mean that China would build a military base in Turkey or the Turks would allow it? I think that's probably a bit too distant in the future, but one cannot rule out such possibilities as the region is changing drastically over time in a very quick way.
Thank you. George, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Allow me first to thank the organizers of this event, a high-profile event, and it is an honor for me to speak with all these distinguished people and, of course, all the people that they are following this event. So I will continue from where Marco has stopped. Actually, China is trying to implement through soft power, means some geopolitical for sure, aims in the broader region. It is very interesting to see something. We're talking about Eastern Mediterranean in the West. We're talking about Mediterranean. If you search and if you see the official bureaucratic and official ministries of China, they are not having departments about Mediterranean. There is nothing like Eastern Mediterranean Directorate, for example. If there is a directorate of South Europe, and there is a directorate for North Africa, but not the whole region as a whole. And this is a very interesting point needed to be made in order to understand maybe what they are trying to do. The first thing, if you want my opinion on this, is that intentionally they are not actually putting in the same basket the whole geographic space, because the connotation of this is, okay, I have some geopolitical / military / security aspects and targets. by dividing, at least in terms of its bureaucracy, the regions in North Africa, Gulf states, and Southeast Europe or European Union, I think that they can pass in a more soft way what exactly they want to do. And my opinion on this, what exactly they want to do, is this one. Since I had the honor to do my PhD in the University of Durham, so I know the broader region very nice, and I dealt quite a lot with Eastern Mediterranean and all these kind of things. I have to allow me to give you a very short my view about the strategic importance of the Mediterranean. Mediterranean is very, very important whenever the European Union or the European continent or subcontinent is considered important. So Mediterranean is not by itself a space which is important. It is the bridge for an important continent, which is European important space, which is, for example, the European Union or Eastern Europe. So I think that the Chinese, they want to make a bridgehead here in order to exert influence and leverage on the rest of Europe. And something else very, very important, which I dealt with within the framework of the Greek-Turkish relationships and about the Eastern question, which according to my perspective, it's an internal Eastern question. When we're talking about Eastern question, as you can understand, or most of you might know, we're talking about how you are going to dismember the Ottoman Empire. My point in my research, it was that the Eastern question is not exactly this. The Eastern question has to do with the division of power in the various shores of the Mediterranean. In our case, I mean in Greece and Turkey, of the two sides of the Aegean. This thing can be expanded into the whole Mediterranean region. The point is that there is instability in the Mediterranean region when you don't have a friendly power all around its shores. Whenever you have this kind of situation, for example, this situation is now, then you have great powers from extra-regional great powers, which are trying to infiltrate the region, let's say Russia, to find exit to the warm seas, as well know, if we know the Anglophone literature on this. You have the United States, which they want to deter Russia, or the British Empire, which wanted to deter Tsarist Russia, and now China is playing this role right now. But the Chinese are more clever, if I may, in relation to the Russians, for example. They are not using military power on this. They are using mainly the soft power. How they do that? They go to the various shores of the Mediterranean, I mean to the various countries, and they try to create an environment in these countries which they are going actually to be very friendly to them. And as you can understand, the idea is that during times of crisis between China and the international community or any other great power, they can exert leverage to these countries without military coercion, but with through economic, if we can say, coercion, and turn the polity and the political position of these countries towards favorable directions to them. Example about Greece. First of all, on July 2016, we have the issue of the South China Sea dispute. There was a petition of Philippines. The Hague court, it was in favor of the Philippines case. Actually, Athens backed Beijing for this. And I have to stress that the Greek policy, the official policy, it is in favor and supporting the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas. Why? Because we have a tangible, a real, eminent, and very tough threat from our ally on the East in many, many quotes, according to my opinion, of course. In terms of the Greek-Turkish relationship, I'm not talking about NATO, which we can discuss this, since if somebody read the NATO 2030, which it has been published last Tuesday, you will see that half of the pages, more or less, they refer to Turkey. But this is another issue. So my point here is that Mediterranean is a very strategically important place, not by itself, but because it is the gate to Eastern Europe, it is the gate to Europe. So the Chinese, because they know that they are not in a position up until now, maybe to exert military leverage, or because there is an ancient civilization and they know very well how these things go, they try and they prefer actually to go through the soft power and the implementation of all these kind of activities. So I think that there is a geopolitical grand plan and master plan of China. This master plan, more or less, it has to do, and it has more or less the same, let's say, strategic targets of Russia in the region. So for the time being, of course, they are having some, to a certain extent, compatible interests in the region. As Marco said, we have continuous right now military exchanges, and from 2015, if I'm not mistaken, we have a military exercise naval of Russia and China in the region. And of course, the main price for this kind of policy is going to be Europe, because I'm a fan of Sir Halford Mackinder, which I suppose that most of you you are familiar with, which says, for example, that whoever rules East Europe commands the heartland, meaning the broader pivot area of where Russia is now, and whoever rules the heartland commands the world island, meaning Eurasia plus Africa. So whoever rules the world island controls the world, okay? So the whole planet. I think that it is a very important issue. What the Chinese are doing here, they are doing with incremental movements and changes, okay? They are not moving like bulldozers here in order to erase some kind of resistance, tough resistance, and they are trying to implement this kind of policy. Within this framework, I can explain what is happening between China and Greece from the side of China.
George, could I just stop you there for a second, because I'm keen to get another question in here. We watch the Chinese investment in the China, or through the China Ocean Shipping Company, COSCO, centered on Piraeus, which has been remarkable. It's a $3 billion investment, which Premier Xi has referred to as the head of the dragon, rather suspiciously perhaps. And he says that because it's clearly a point of departure, given the things you're talking about. Could you and Marco please address how this very substantial investment in Piraeus, the port of Piraeus, and the development of a major shipping center is going to impact things going forward? Marco, could you start us off on that and then come back to George?
I mean, as we said earlier in my earlier statement, was the fact that Piraeus is obviously one of the largest ports in Europe, and it's connected throughout the Balkans. It's the key element for them is that Western Balkans, which remains the weakest link in Europe. Parts, specifically looking at parts of ex-Yugoslavia, ridden by conflict just less than 20 years ago, still very much vulnerable to external influence, not just Chinese, but also in parts of the Balkan. If you look in a place like Serbia, which I'd mentioned, enormous historical Russian influence in the region. So when you have that link, and plus you want to create the transportation lines, the rail lines between Piraeus and the rest of the Balkan region, that gives you a key foothold. I mean, terms have been used historically during the Second World War, you know, the underbelly of Europe. And I think to a certain extent, you could see the Chinese using that logic of seeing Southern Europe, and particularly Southeastern Europe, to be specific, Southeastern Europe as being the weakest link in Europe. Once again, my original statement was the fact that they're looking at countries with weak economies easily that can be, let's say, bought to an extent. Yeah, I mean, bought, but it's in a way that it can provide them with leverage within Europe, and using allied, what you could call key states in Southeastern Europe to their advantage when negotiating or dealing with the Europeans, with the bigger powers, obviously being the traditional Western European powers, primarily France and Germany. It gives it enormous leverage. Piraeus is a key point in that. It's a critical structure. You used it, I mean, you mentioned the term head of the dragon. Xi Jinping, unlike the previous Chinese leaders, especially from the time of Deng Xiaoping, starting with the opening of China in 1980. From 1980 until 2012, when Xi assumed power, we're looking at largely a 32-year period once the opening of China took place. And before that, the general consensus was that keep growing and growing, but do so with a low profile and use modest rhetoric. With Xi, that's been upended completely since 2012. As time has gone by, he's become more and more vocal in displaying Chinese power, doing it in a way with, just openly, blatantly doing it. And I think that term is him using head of the dragon is quite transparent in terms of what his intentions are, not just in the short term, but in the long term.
George.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to continue the thought of Marco, because I'm totally accept and support what this view. Actually, it is a two-headed dragon, not one-headed, and I'm going to explain myself. The one head is in the Piraeus port. Actually, you can see that since it's geographic terms, if you take it from business and economic perspective, all the merchandise, 80% first of all of the merchandise of Europe with China, it is maritime. It is through sea. Yeah, okay, it's taking place through sea, through the sea lines. So if the Chinese, they will have a entry port in Europe, in Piraeus, and not, for example, in Rotterdam, they are going to save at least 5 to 7 days in the transportation cost of the shipments. Obviously, the prices are going to go down. And naturally, as you can understand, they're going to become even more competitive to the international and the European markets. So the first thing, it is first and foremost in geography. And this is very, very important. However, there is a weak spot on the Piraeus port. The Piraeus port is too south first, in terms of Eastern Europe, and something else. We don't have yet, about Greece, you should not have into your mind what is happening in England or in Germany or in Holland. The rail network is not so good due to the geographic terrain mainly. It is very difficult, as you can understand, because we are a mountainous, with interruption of mountains land, okay, country. So it's not very easy to develop a railway, an efficient railway network. So there is going to be important here in Piraeus. However, let's discuss about the second head of the dragon. The second head of the dragon is going to be in Thessaloniki port in the northern Greece. Why? Because with the cooperation of Chinese companies and Germany, it is a master plan is taking place right now, almost 20 billion plan. So whatever is going to happen and has happened in Piraeus is peanuts. 3 billion. I'm talking now about a project of 17 to 20 billion, which has to do with what? The widening of the Axios River, which is nearby Thessaloniki, Salonika, in order to be navigationable, like Rhine from Rotterdam. So what they are trying to make right now is to create a Rotterdam of the South in Thessaloniki. This has not been, there are no headlines in Europe about this, which is, as you can understand, it is a project of enormous importance. And I stress just one thing. It's not a coincidence that Greece found a common ground with Skopje in order to solve the name issue right now, last year. These two things, they coexist. It was very interesting that in the international exhibition of Thessaloniki 2 years ago, the previous Prime Minister of Greece, Mr. Alexis Tsipras, in order to excuse and justify this settlement with Skopje, he said it is made for one basic reason. And the basic reason is to sort out the very important political problem. According to his views, of course, it has been resolved. In my opinion, it has not been resolved. But in any case, he used an excuse that if we resolve this kind of issue, we are going to have the flow of investment of Chinese companies in Thessaloniki port in order to widen the Axios River. And of course, this project is not, it's an international, it's not only for Greece, it is also from Skopje, which the Axios River cross also that country, and then it goes to Serbia, as Marco said, which they are planning to connect the Vardar River or Axios River in Greek with the Sava River nearby Belgrade, which is going to be connected with the Danube. So imagine how the whole geopolitical situation is going to change through this project. And it's not, again, a coincidence that 1 day or 2 days, if I'm not mistaken, before the very crucial discussion in the Greek parliament about that issue, about the name of Skopje, Miss Angela Merkel came. Chancellor Angela Merkel came to Greece 2 or 3 days before. It was a week, something like that. So the point here, according to my opinion, is that the Chinese and the German factor in, actually the German forward, they are cooperating in a very, to a large extent between each other. The Germans, because they need to send their exports to China. Why? Because actually their policies has devastated the whole South Europe. In reality, the last 10 years, they don't have anywhere to sell. This is the point. After what has happened in Europe the last 10 years. Be careful, don't misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm not saying that it is a fault of the Germans. I'm saying that there are many institutions, countries, or policies to be blamed, but I mean that they are trying to take advantage of this. Okay, so they are trying to cooperate now with the Chinese. China, it is the closest trade partner of Germany the last 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, 3-4 years. So the whole thing about Greece, it is to make actually a gateway which more or less is going to replace or is going to supplement Rotterdam. And this, due to geography, it is a fact that is going to happen. Okay, so it is a two-headed dragon if we're talking about Piraeus and the port of Thessaloniki. And I suggest to all the friends that are participating in this event to start checking about this. And you will see that it is a very interesting, maybe it is more important what is going to happen in northern Greece than the investment in Piraeus.
George, thank you. That's very interesting and an appropriate moment, because I think there's a defense and security aspect of this, to ask Lady Olga Maitland to put a question to you guys. Olga.
Well, thank you, Roddy, very much indeed. I'd like to congratulate Marco and Dr. Filis for their contributions. And I do have a quick thought. Marco, you made the point that China is the new kid on the block in the Mediterranean, indeed in the world. And people are still kind of thrown off their feet, being faced with Chinese state capitalism versus our normal kind of open markets. So there's a lot of adjustment to be made. But I'm just really wondering, there are several factors in a geopolitical point of view. One, which perhaps Dr. Philippus could answer, is there a concern in Greece to follow the experiences of Australia, who have traded very successfully with China for many years and boosted their GDP until the last year? And now they have been hit by massive tariffs and punishments because they dared to criticize China and the Wuhan incident over the coronavirus. So there is a big issue there. There is a risk. Secondly, I think also we do see this geopolitical tussle between China and America and the EU, and they are not really quite comfortable about this new kid on the block who is throwing money at the Eastern Mediterranean. But other people could have done that too. America could have done, but they didn't. It was a vacuum. And I think there is another point which is quite interesting, is that around the region, China has been very careful to be apolitical in a sense. It is soft power all the way. They have made real friendships from Israel, with whom they have technological agreements, much to the unhappiness of Washington. They have relationships with Egypt, Turkey, we know, and so it goes on. So they are a real force to be reckoned. So I really would appreciate hearing the point of view both from Dr. Philippos and indeed from Marco.
And in terms of the Australian experience, I mean, I agree with you on that point. Basically, that's, I think, George and I, and some of the points we had made originally was alluding to that fact that it's going to politically and economically more vulnerable areas that are strategically important to make primary investments, to have the leverage in terms of their economic interests and in terms of their diplomatic interests, to ensure that those particular states come to their aid in times of crisis internationally when they need support. And Australia and some other countries in East Asia, and also we can even extend that to parts of Latin America and Africa, whereby whenever they feel that they've been crossed, they will come back. They will be blatant in terms of their threats. I mean, I think in Europe itself, I mean, there was one high-ranking Czech political official in recent months who visited Taiwan, and at a meeting, it was at a press conference between the chief Chinese diplomat and Ms. Merkel, whereby the Chinese diplomat said that the Czech Republic, as a result, there would be retribution, and whereby the European official made the announcement clearly that we don't work under threats and we will not be intimidated by threats. So I think in terms of that aggressive Chinese approach diplomatically, it's been labeled also as wolf warrior diplomacy, which is a Chinese film about wolf warriors that it's very nationalistic. So they've given that term from the film, they've given it to the diplomacy. So I think in that sense, there's been, to a large extent, in terms of, at least on the rhetorical front, there's been a lot of overreach by China. And the fact that I think Australia is a perfect example of a country, obviously in Asia, but within, I would say within a Western framework, democratic country, part of the Five Eyes. It's a country that I think, in my opinion, has had a great ride in the last 20, 30 years. It's had a fantastic economic ride with Chinese investment and Chinese absorbing their commodities. But I think there's been a rude awakening, particularly after the COVID crisis, that I think it serves as a lesson to many other countries. Be careful in your outreach with China, because it's not going to be all pleasant, soft power, just economic and diplomatic. There's going to be a further edge to it as time goes by. And I think the Australian Prime Minister Morrison has realized that. And I would even go beyond the public sector. So we're speaking about governments right now, Western governments, but I would even extend that to the Western private sector, that for far too long, they have been enamored with profits, the economic opportunities, and that's all they see. They don't see anything beyond, well, not all of them, but I say many of them, probably too many of them, have seen China from that perspective as an economic opportunity. And the Chinese leadership has been very adept and very skillful in realizing that with most Western powers, whether government, public or private sector, have much of a short-term thinking. And I think now it's time for the West to wake up and to realize, I think for far too long, Western leaders, both public and private sector, have fallen asleep at the wheel. And I think the COVID crisis will be the moment in which there was a rude awakening.
Okay. Well, I will add to what Lady Maitland said and what Marco said. Remember Tajikistan. Okay, a European country is not Tajikistan, but the point is that in order to build a power plant, they gave up a gold mine to the Chinese some years ago. And some years before, because they had debt, they surrendered a land, territory. They changed with their willingness, their borders, Tajikistan with China. Okay, so the point here is very clear. China right now, it doesn't concern about democratic peace deficit or democratic peace theoretical approaches about who I'm going to help and who I'm not going to help. They're following this developmental peace approach, which the point is, I'm going to help you, I'm going to give you economic help, aid, reconstruct your infrastructure or whatever. No care about if we're talking about a democratically ruled country or the rule of law prevails there. They want, this is a very important issue. They might call it a pragmatism. Okay, I will accept that. But pragmatism also means realism. And realism also means that you are trying to safeguard your interests. So what is happening is clearly a geopolitical expansion of China, for sure. So I agree totally with Marco saying that they are not having a vision, the European leaders. This vision, this mentality, very bad mentality, has been proven to its all glorious level with Greece, if I may, and with the current financial crisis in Europe. They were taking the approach of an accountant, not the approach of a leader. Okay, so sorry to say that I'm not having anything about the accountants, but you understand that when we're talking about high strategy and politics, you take and the accountant, but you also you should take into consideration something else. The strategic intent, as we say, what you are losing if you are focusing on something which is going to give you some benefit now, but you are going to lose the world tomorrow. And this is what my personal opinion, it has to happen in the European Union very soon. But in any case, the point here is about China. So for sure, we need to have, in order for capitalism to work, after all, a working relationship with China, but they need to be on alert, the leaderships in Europe, because the Chinese, they don't do that out of charity. They are not Mother Teresa's. They do that out of geopolitical ambition in order to exert leverage and take the position that they think that it deserves them. So you asked also Lady Maitland about what is the discussion in Greece. The discussion in Greece right now, and 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when we were in the heydays of our quarrel with the European Union, it was that China is going to help us. There were actually voices of prudent politicians, prudent in very many quotes, as we say in Greece, saying that China will save us, or China is going to give us money, or China is going to do whatever to the bad Germans or whatever. So the level of analysis and the message to the public opinion in Greece, it was this one. First of all, anti-Europeanism or Euroscepticism. Of course, personally, allow me to tell you that Euroscepticism, it's not exactly like anti-Europeanism. Euroscepticism is to think about Europe. Anti-Europeanism is not want to Europe. This is because it has to do with the Greek language, this thing. So I'm telling myself, I'm describing myself as a Eurosceptic, but not in the sense of anti-European, but just as a Eurosceptic. So the point is that in Greece, there was nothing like that as a debate. Of course, now, as we have superficially passed by this financial crisis, up until we have entered to the new one with the COVID-19, of course, of the last year, there were some efforts, I have to say, to disassociate a bit ourselves from China. For example, there were some movements into the port of Thessaloniki of who is going to own that port of Thessaloniki. This had to do and with the Russian interests. So, and also we have something else that is taking place. You can see, we might say that the United States are withdrawing from Eastern Mediterranean, but in reality, the United States are returning in Greece. You will have, yes, this is what's happening in reality. For example, there is the American, American company which took the third largest shipyard in Greece, and there is negotiation for the second one, largest shipyard in Greece. We have right now a whole discussion about our, after 10 years, new armament program about our Navy. The Greek fleet is going to resettle into a second naval station in Crete, nearby the American Suda Bay station, which is going to be further enhanced. The Americans are having now, right now, presence into the northern borders in the very strategically positioned city of Alexandroupoli, near the Evros River, which is the border with Turkey. And through Alexandroupoli, they are going to service all Eastern European countries in terms of logistical support with NATO. In the center of Greece, in Larissa city, in the center of Greece, we have right now American drones, which they are stationed. My point here is that, yes, we have the Chinese presence in Greece, but right now, if I may, the expression of the cavalry is coming back more or less into Greece. The Americans, and under the Trump administration, and I suppose, and for sure, under the Biden administration, they're going to actually increase their footprint into the region through Greece. And this has been done, and for the reasons that we have discussed about the Chinese effort to penetrate through Greece the rest of the continent, and of course, our ally into the east, about Turkey. So we are going to have many developments on this matter in Eastern Mediterranean the following months.
George, thank you very much. And Olga, thank you for your question, and Marios also for your answer. So I'm going to pass now the mic, as it were, to the Institute Director, Martin.
Roddy, thank you very much, and thank you very much for all the panelists so far. A really fascinating insight for a question, I think, that isn't as well recognized as a risk area as it should be. And perhaps if I could just come back to that word risk and as a question, and ask both the panelists about the risk implications in the longer term. And I say longer term, by that I mean perhaps only 3 years, although events tend to move quite quickly these days with geopolitical risk. Perhaps if I can put the question about risk in the Eastern Mediterranean and the involvement of China through 3 different lenses. Firstly, in relation to naval activity. And I think Marco did mention at the start that actually Chinese naval activity is extremely limited, unlike in the Indian Ocean, for example, where there's been greater involvement in anti-piracy operations. But what would be the possibility and indeed the likelihood and the risk in the next 3 years of greater Chinese naval activity in the Eastern Mediterranean, considering there is clearly a strong economic buildup, and what's the risk of that naval activity? Obviously, it's a very small sea, and it's a very busy sea with a lot of different players with different ambitions. The second lens, perhaps, is about people and workers in those ports and hubs throughout the region. What's the risk of tensions with Chinese workers, tensions with Chinese companies based in those ports around the region? And putting that into context of some quite clear tensions that have developed in parts of Africa over the past decade, especially 15 years more so, with large concentrations of Chinese workers coming into certain areas where there's a great deal of Chinese investment. So lesser local opportunities perhaps, and an influx of Chinese workers. And then the third one is sort of macroeconomically in regard to debt traps. The greater Chinese investment, what we suspect or worry about the nature of the Belt and Road Initiative, how might that create debt traps, if at all, in the region, in the Eastern Mediterranean? And are we too worried about that risk, or indeed all those risks? So trying to frame it through 3 lenses: possibility of military naval conflict, not conflict, but tension in the next 3 years. Secondly, the influx of workers and tensions of people. And thirdly, the sort of economic risk of debt traps. Do you have any comment about those 3 lenses and how you might see risk in the next 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the first one you mentioned, for example, military involvement, I think for now, for the immediate future, I think China is, like I said, the Eastern Mediterranean is already an overcrowded zone. It's already fully militarized by local players, and the external players primarily being obviously Western Europeans, and France, which is a Mediterranean power, or it's Western Mediterranean. And then also the Americans. The military presence of the United States should not be underestimated. There's the talk all the time of the Americans pulling out, but all the bases that George had referred to, and the increasing American involvement in Greece, and also you could see improvements of American relations with Cyprus. You have the port of Haifa in Israel, which remains a very important base for the Americans in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think at this stage, the Chinese largely are willing, put it in very crude terms, they're willing to allow others to do the dirty work as long as they're maintaining the stability necessary for them to pursue their economic interests. Now, other parts of the world are different. We're talking about the Horn of Africa with piracies, Indian Ocean, South China Sea, East China Sea, the Straits of Taiwan. These are areas that directly impact them, where they're more than willing to make their presence militarily felt. So they're taking a very selective approach. In other words, in terms of projecting their global power from a military perspective, closer to home, they're much more willing to do it, but far beyond, less willing to do so unless necessary. And I don't think necessity has demanded that from them, at least at this stage. Secondly, in terms of the Chinese workers and the influx of Chinese workers, I think that particular argument applies mostly to the areas, parts of North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. From a security perspective, the one specific example that comes to mind of China because of a dangerous situation, a risk situation, used the term risk, was with the outbreak of the war in Libya in early 2011. 36,000 Chinese workers were in Libya at the time. China had billions, some estimates go beyond over $20 billion of contracts with the Gaddafi government. And as a result of the collapse of the government and then the eventual fall of Gaddafi, Chinese basically were put into a situation, I say humiliation, but it wasn't particularly satisfying and pleasant for them to have to rely on other powers to try to withdraw their 36,000 workers. Hence also the need for that increase for a military presence, though limited, one that could lead to the evacuation of their citizens. And then once again, you have the loss of the billions of dollars in contracts. In Southern Europe, you don't have this issue, or in the Balkans, you don't have this issue of too many Chinese workers. While in North Africa, and more than North Africa, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, yes, you have that issue of Chinese workers, thousands of them doing infrastructure, massive projects, whether it's building of roads, power plants, anything regarding infrastructure, they bring in their own workers, which for a certain extent that creates circulation of money in the area, but also a lot of other local workers aren't being directly employed. So you may have secondary or tertiary effects, economic impact, but you don't have as much as a direct employment, which creates resentment at the local level. And I believe in countries, if I could recall correctly, countries like Zambia, you've had a reaction to Chinese workers and to Chinese companies. On your third point, in terms of on the macro level, the class debt traps being DEBT, and not debt, but determined is being used in a certain way. So in terms of debt traps, you see that throughout much of the developing world. And obviously, when I spoke originally about Chinese investment going into areas particularly that are strategically important, but politically and economically vulnerable. And the weak point in Europe, as we already emphasized, were the Western Balkans, areas of ex-Yugoslavia, where the Chinese have retained quite a bit of leverage economically. And in terms of using that economic leverage to push for their agenda within the broader European Union, is happening, remains real, and is likely to increase as time goes by.
So, if you want my input on this, regarding the naval activity, I agree with Marco. We should not, at least in the foreseeable future, I don't see, and I don't think, unless something very significant happens, more and further naval presence than what we have right now in Eastern Mediterranean of the Chinese. I suppose, and I think that more or less they are trying to back up the Russians, because after the naval exercises in Eastern Mediterranean with Russia and China in 2015, the next year, these exercises took place in South China Sea, and the following year in the Baltic. So I think that there is a ping pong, as you can understand. I will help you, you will help me in our areas of interest. So I don't think that this is going to be the case in a real life scenario. Marco mentioned about the 36,000 workers in Libya. Actually, in Greece, we were amazed in 2011 because it was the Hellenic Navy which evacuated, actually, all these people, or the vast majority of these people from this region, and they sent it to Crete. And from there, from Crete, the Chinese, they took them. So yes, it is an issue of embarrassment, a national embarrassment, a great power like China not being able to have presence and exert leverage or demonstrate flag in a crisis region. About the people now, I would say, first of all, there are around 1 million Chinese in the broader region of interest of what we're discussing right now in Europe and the MENA, Middle East and North Africa. The point here is mainly about the security, about the nature of the investments actually that they are taking place and what the Chinese are doing and which companies are taking over or they are actually acquiring shares in the European Union. So the most important security issue, if you want my opinion, it has to do with technology. It has to do with the satellites. It has to do with the 5G, what Huawei is doing with this kind of telecommunication networks. The last meeting of the American president with the Greek prime minister, actually, we had many issues to discuss from the Greek perspective. But what the White House actually put forward in the official announcement of the visit of the Greek prime minister was the discussion of the 5G of Huawei. And we say in Greece, most of the group, what are they going to discuss? The 5G or about what's happening in the Mediterranean with the techs? So you see, this is another issue which I support what I told you previously on the question of Lady Maitland about how the discussion is taking place in Greece. So far, more or less, for the public opinion, is rather irrelevant because we have more pressing issues to discuss. And the last about the debt traps, yes, I agree on this position, but I don't think, at least, that this may apply to Greece. Greece, so far and for the foreseeable future, is within the protective wings of the European Union. It is in the euro area. Eurozone area. I don't think that Greece is going to be allowed, in any case, to be take a loan from somewhere else. Actually, the memorandums that we have actually signed, the 4 memorandums the last 10 years, one of the basic prerequisites for the signature is not to ask for money from anybody else than the European mechanism, IMF, and of course, if you go into the market, okay, to sell bonds, of course, and this kind of stuff. So I hope that I covered a bit at least for Greece. I don't think that there's going to be this kind of stuff. The point, of course, it doesn't apply, for example, to Turkey. To Turkey right now, sorry, just to one point, to make my point here. Right now, one of the saviors of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the economy of Turkey is China. What it's doing is Qatar, China, and of course all the black economy that it has developed. And this is the reason, more or less, why Turkey right now is not collapsed in economic terms completely. But they surrender infrastructure to the Chinese. And maybe this is an issue of great concern.
And just to add a point on the issue of Turkey, I mean, if you look just 10 years ago, Erdogan, he's been constantly, and part of his international profile is to be a protector or a leader of the broader Muslim world. And up until 10 years ago, he was constantly criticizing China about the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang, of which he referred to often as East Turkmenistan. And he would always present himself as their protector, as their spokesperson internationally. And obviously, as the situation has changed drastically, the economic situation in Turkey, and with the greater involvement of China, you have not seen any such criticisms from Mr. Erdogan anymore. And that's just one example of the increasing Chinese influence throughout the border region, but in this case, references being made specifically to Turkey.
Very, very comprehensive outlook there on. I'm sorry for making the point very broad as well. That was almost everything, military, people, and macroeconomics. But I think you both covered them very succinctly. As we still have a little bit of time, we have one question, I think, from Sunil Shastri. Could we let Sunil in? Are you ready, Sunil, to ask a bit of a broader question again, I think?
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Roddy. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Olga, Marco, and Philippos for a fantastic webinar.
George.
George, sorry, I'm sorry.
George.
Sorry. My question is, you know, as all of you actually have mentioned, that China has been doing nothing mysterious. You know, they've been doing what all the countries have been doing in the past. Yeah. They're just throwing a lot of money at you, right? They have done it in Africa. They have shown you a trailer by throwing lots of money in Africa, and West has not done anything about it. Now, despite China's powerhouse status, the West, I think, still has more money, more clout, and more reach, and historically so too. So why is the West not doing exactly the same thing, and that too in its own backyard? Perhaps the West is too fragmented? Thank you.
In the first point regarding, yeah, I mean, your last point that you made, there's been many of the Western powers, I use the word short-termism in terms of not just the public sector, but also less so the private sector, but I would say much more the public sector, is many of them are not thinking about the next generation. Unfortunately, they're thinking about the next election. So as a result, such short-sighted vision. They don't think as strategically. I mean, constant reference is made to the post-war generation, but obviously the post-war generation many of them had confronted a global depression, had confronted, you know, the Axis powers in the Second World War. So they emerged with a better sense of understanding. They had points of reference. They confronted existential crises, which made them much more visionary and think much more long-term. In the West, yes, we have had crisis. The most recent, obviously, being the COVID crisis. You have the 2008 crisis. For the Americans, at least, it was 9/11. Maybe it didn't have the impact globally as much as it did for the Americans. So there have been crises that we've confronted during this generation. But in order to think more long-term, obviously, you need to, and I don't know if these current crises are going to serve as a lesson. Hopefully they will, particularly the COVID crisis. But that's the issue of vision. Whether it's within Europe, or within the US, the broader Western democratic world, we could say, there has been a lack of vision, and a serious part of vision. And that lack of vision has basically left a void, which the Chinese Communist Party has skillfully exploited in the last 20 to 30 years. I mean, you have to give them credit in terms of their unity of purpose, their dedication, their commitment, and the hard work ethic to get to the point that they are right now in such a brief point. So that's part of it. And then I would say the other part of it is in terms of, you look at the private sector, which I already mentioned, in terms of the private sector is not thinking long-term. They're thinking about quick, immediate profits. And then there's a fact that, you know, you're looking at a world whereby the narrative of once I'll refer to that post-war narrative of unity amongst the West against the common enemy during the Cold War, there's not that sense of unity that exists, because the way the growth of China and the influence of the Chinese Communist Party has been a lot more skillful, a lot more subtle, and I think the COVID crisis that I explained earlier exposed a lot of it. But during the last 20 to 30 years, it skillfully pursues a policy in a very soft way, and through economic influence, using the language of friendship, using the language of, you know, of good spirit, of economic outreach, while the raw agenda, which I think is quite clear, has become more evident. It's come to the surface. Now it's more of if you look, for example, that one example of the Australians, I think explains in a nutshell what the rest of the world needs to be aware of and very wary about.
Thank you very much, Marco. George, may I suggest we have another comment, I think, from Peter de Vink, a comment and a question, I think. Could we just let Peter ask that question? I think that might come to you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the organizers and for the speakers. It was so interesting to hear all this. But I have to say that I feel more on the wavelength of Marco, because I really cannot believe that the West tolerates the way that China has done all the things that it is doing today, whether it's Hong Kong, it's going to be Taiwan, what they are doing with the Muslims up north, west of China, what they are doing with swine. I've got something on my app that you cannot believe, to see literally millions of live pigs all being buried alive because they have swine fever. I mean, they think totally different, and we in the West have to become much more realistic that they are after domination. And I can't get my head around it, that so few people really are aware of it. That's what I would like to say.
Could we go back to George on that? Because
I can say two things to Mr. Devine. First of all, if we look at the broad picture, since I am a geopolitical analyst, I like to see the broad picture. The question was, who is the main enemy, in quotes or without quotes, of the West, Russia or China? So if the answer is Russia, the response to this, it will be to be in good terms with China. If the answer is China, the response is going to be, we need to be in good terms with Russia. For example, Trump administration, at least this is what it was saying. So the point here is that, first of all, nobody in the West cannot see, is not in a position to understand and comprehend what is happening in China. But also they can understand that in this trilateral relationship, West, if we suppose that the West is united, I mean, United States, London, and Brussels or Berlin or whatever. On the other hand is Russia, Moscow, and the other is Beijing. They need to make up their minds, more or less, in order to see who is the main adversary, let's put it that way, competitor, in order to try to do something with the other part of this trilateral example, this trilateral relationship. The most interesting example is what has happened, the opening of the United States to China in the 70s with Henry Kissinger. This was one of the main reasons which changed the balances of the Cold War and took China from the hands of the Soviet Union, more or less. So within this broader framework, I can understand the people that they support in the West, Vladimir Putin, or the people that they support this China in general. So allow me to say that this is what is happening. It's not that nobody else is tolerating things. And another very important issue is that the Chinese, right now, they are holding too much of the debt of the United States and of many European countries. I would like to add to the question of Sunil, if we have the money. We don't. And you know why we don't? Because, first of all, it has been proven in the first stages of the crisis that José Manuel Barroso went to Beijing in order to beg, in reality, for money for Europe to be rescued 10 years ago. And secondly, this is an issue I think that is a great debate. Personally speaking, I have the problem with the deindustrialization of my country. And the problem of the West, according to my opinion, is that it has been deindustrialized to such an extent that the financial actually gains, because we focus on the the tertiary economic sector, could not overcome the basic problems that deindustrialization brought to our countries. So the problem is that it is systemic right now. And systemic, and in terms of geopolitics, in terms of geopolitics, who is the main adversary of the West, China or Russia, and in geoeconomic terms, that right now the West is vulnerable because the financial sector, which actually it is the comparative advantage of the West, well, the news are that it has eventually collapsed the last 10 years. And we found ourselves naked from industry because the factory of the planet has gone to China. So I would say that this is how we need morals. This is my opinion. Okay, the things, and we can interpret them.
George, thank you. We have, I'm afraid, Sunil, we have run out of time, as a matter of fact, which of course is always,
unfortunately.
it's a wonderful characteristic of our webinars that the subject is so interesting, as we've heard from Peter and Sunil and Marco and George, that there's so much more to be discussed. What I would say, and I'm sure that Olga and Marco, being members of our International Advisory Council, would agree, is that the purpose of the Asia Scotland Institute in Scotland is to open people's eyes to what is going on, to inform them, to encourage, particularly young people, tomorrow's leaders, to have an inquiring mind, because in this, the century of Asia, with the uncertainties that we see in the United States, we have to understand what the major players in Asia are doing. Not just China, it's India, it's Vietnam, it's Indonesia, that vast Muslim country. And that's what we intend to do in the coming months and as we move into 2021. So in thanking Martin and Andrew for pulling this together, to Olga and the Defence and Security Forum for sharing the event with us, and to our two outstanding speakers, Marco and George, I really would like to thank you all for what has been an extraordinarily interesting. Marco.
Just one last statement. As we've spoken about the growth of China and the expansion of China, but it's important all along throughout the argument not to forget one thing and not to underestimate. The internal weaknesses of China are in part what drive its expansion overseas. And I think not much attention is paid to the internal weaknesses and the internal challenges that it has to face.
I quite agree, Marco, and history reminds us that aggressive foreign policy is often pursued by leaders to obscure the very real domestic problems that exist at home. So thank you for saying that. The same is probably true of Turkey and a number of other countries as well. So to all of you, if I don't see you again before Christmas, we have got two more important events coming up. We wish you a happy Christmas. And when we come to wish each other a happy new year, I can say for one thing absolutely certainly, which is hopefully 2021 will be significantly better than 2020. So anyway, on that note, thank you everybody, and we will meet again soon.
Allow me to thank you. Allow me to thank you again from my place here from Athens. Greetings from Athens. And I wait all of you here to see you in person. And it was a great honor for me. Great honor and a great joy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ευχαριστώ. Thank you.
Παρακαλώ.